All right, Mr. Hart, do you go by agent or officer or some other title you prefer?
Agent Hart is fine. It's former, but whatever works.
Okay, well, we'll just call you Agent Hart then. Before we get started with your testimony, now that you've been placed under oath, I just want to ask you, because the proceedings are being live streamed and available for public access, have you reviewed or watched or observed any of the trial testimony in this case since it began?
No, I have not, Your Honor.
All right. And have you discussed with anyone else their testimony that has testified in the case?
No, I have not.
Okay. Thank you for that affirmation. Ms. Blake, you can inquire on direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you please spell your name for the record?
Douglas Hart, H-A-R-T.
Where are you currently employed?
I am currently the Chief Deputy at the Canyon County Sheriff's Office
How long have you been employed with them?
since September of 2022.
What did you do prior to taking that position?
Prior to that position, I was a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for approximately 27 years.
Did you hold various assignments or have specific roles you played within the special agent?
Yes, I did.
And what were some of those?
My first assignment was to the Honolulu, Hawaii field office, where I spent 5.5 years on the organized crime drug squad, conducting complex multi-subject investigations. My second assignment was to the Lewiston, Idaho resident agency, where I spent 7 years working primarily violent crime and persons crimes on the Nez Perce Indian Reservation. My third assignment was to be the supervisor of the Treasure Valley Metro Violent Crime Task Force, which is a local task force headed by the FBI to investigate gangs and violent crimes. And my final assignment, my last 7 years in the FBI, I was the supervisor for the southern 34 counties in Idaho for all criminal programs. And it was in that capacity that I became involved in this investigation.
And you just mentioned becoming involved in this investigation. Can you tell me a little bit about how the FBI ended up involved in this case?
Certainly. This case was brought to our attention in November, towards the end of November of 2019. And because it involved 2 missing children, that is something that the FBI has a specific expertise in. And it's something that we work very closely and cooperatively with our state and city and county partners in investigations involving missing children.
And when you became involved, or when the FBI became involved, is it fair to say that it became a joint investigation?
Yes.
Do you recall which agencies were involved?
Yes. We were initially contacted by the Rexburg Police Department and the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, or Sheriff's Office, excuse me. And then subsequently, for a brief period of time, the State of Idaho Attorney General's Office, and I think and Social Security and a few other entities had smaller parts of the investigation that they worked on.
And as part of your involvement in this investigation, did you take on specific tasks?
I did.
What were some of those?
First and foremost, I was the FBI supervisor in this case, which meant that I was the reviewer and approver of most of the FBI work product that went into our case file. And then I also had an investigative role due to our minimal staffing in eastern Idaho and some transfers that had taken place, which further diminished our staffing. I carried several investigative assignments within this case.
Do you recall as part of your assignments in this case, looking into some iCloud accounts.
Yes, I did.
Do you know who those iCloud accounts were associated with?
Yes, they were associated with Lori Vallow.
And do you recall the names on those accounts?
Yes, there were two accounts. The first account was called Lori 4 Style with the number 4. And the second account was called Lolly Time.
And when you looked at these iCloud accounts, could you tell how long they'd been in existence?
Yes.
And what did you learn regarding that?
So the first account, Lori for Style, was the oldest account. It was the bulk of that account started in 2016, but there were some materials that were present there as early as 2011, 2012. And then Lolly Time was more recent. It essentially started July 1st of 2019.
And when you were reviewing these, could you tell if some messages had been deleted? What exactly were you able to see in relation to any messages or the content there?
So the content on both iCloud accounts is extremely voluminous. We utilized a software system called Cellbrite, which doesn't change any of the data within the iCloud, but organizes it in a way that makes it reviewable. For instance, there will be a section for SMS or text messages, a section for videos and photographs and contacts and Bluetooth and on and on and on. And so this software just takes the mirrored image of the iCloud account and organizes it into its component parts. And so I reviewed all of those component parts for both of the iCloud accounts.
And you mentioned that both of these accounts had voluminous information on them.
Yes.
And in preparation for your testimony today, did you create a summary exhibit?
I did.
And does the summary exhibit contain some content from Lolly Time?
The summary exhibit for today is almost exclusively from Lolly Time, with the exception of one slide, which is from Lori for Style.
And do you believe that this would assist and aid you in your testimony today?
Yes, it would.
Do you believe it would aid the jurors in understanding the evidence?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 183. I have provided a copy to counsel. I have a copy for the court, as well as a courtesy copy for Your Honor. As some of the other exhibits for the state, this will actually be, the actual exhibit will be a jump drive containing the PowerPoint, but we have the slides printed off for courtesy.
Okay.
And if I can have the witness shown a copy.
Yes. Could you turn your microphone on, please, Mr. Pryor?
With a note. Judge, my only objection is I would like the officer, it was agent, I'm sorry, officer, deputy, that's acceptable, to just make note of the range that this summary encompasses, if we could. Date, ending date, beginning date.
Certainly, the begin.
This is just part of the admissibility here. Ms. Blake, the witness is being handed that. It sounds like provisionally there's no objection, but if we could identify, and it'll be helpful for the record too, just the date that this encompasses. Date range.
Yes. Agent, are you able to tell us the date range that this would cover?
This exhibit covers a date range of January 2019 through, I believe it is August of 2019.
And is there a reason that that is what the time frame within this exhibit?
Yes, the pertinent portions of the iCloud for today's testimony exist within that specific time frame.
And through the investigation, did you learn when Chad and Lori first met?
Yes.
What did you learn in relation to that?
They met on October 26th, 2018.
And so this exhibit would begin several months after their first meeting?
Yes, it does. There are communications that reference the time frame of their meeting in 2018, but those communications are dated July of 2019.
And through the investigation, did you learn the last known day that Tylee Ryan was seen?
Yes.
And what was that day?
The last known date that Tylee Ryan was seen was September 8th of 2019.
Did you learn the last day JJ Vallow was seen?
Yes, the last day that JJ Vallow was seen was September 22nd of 2019.
And did you also learn the day that Tammy Daybell was declared dead?
Yes, Tammy Daybell was declared dead on October 19th of 2019.
Through the investigation, did you learn when Chad and Lori got married?
Yes, they were married in Hawaii on November 5th of 2019.
And when you became involved in the investigation initially, JJ and Tylee were still missing, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Your Honor, it's my understanding then the exhibit would be stipulated to?
All right, with those dates determined, Mr. Pryor, any objection?
Judge, it's not stipulated to, but there is no objection to the exhibit.
Okay, well then, without objection, State's Exhibit 183 is admitted. The court noting the actual exhibit will be the PowerPoint presentation file on a digital drive. The court has a courtesy copy as well as counsel, and the witness is referring to printed versions that are derived from that PowerPoint presentation.
And Your Honor, I guess just to ensure the record is clear as well, the iCloud accounts have been stipulated to that this content's pulled from.
Okay, so. And I will note that as well. Thank you.
And that is correct, Judge. These have been stipulated as part of the record.
Okay.
And Your Honor, with that, the state would ask permission to publish.
Yes, you may publish.
Agent Hart, when you created this exhibit, did you pull over the content from these iCloud accounts?
I did.
So do some of these contain potential spelling errors, things of that nature?
Yes. Most of what we'll see today are text messages. And so the Cellbrite software arranges them in a reverse chronological order and assigns each text message a line number. Associated with that is a date and a time for the text, and then who it was to or from, and then the actual content of the text. And so I cut and pasted the content of the text exactly as it appears in the iCloud account.
Thank you. And with that, would you go ahead and read these messages into the record?
Yes. This sheet is from the SMS section of Lori for Style at iCloud.com. Line number 2585, January 23rd, 2019, 5:18 p.m. Text from Lori Vallow to Audrey Baratario. Hi, Audrey. This is Lori. I would love to talk to you sometime. Text me or call me. I'm excited to be able to talk to you about what we both know. Line number 2584.
Judge, could we approach?
Yes. All right, Ms. Blake, if you'd like to continue with direct, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent Hart, if you could go ahead and continue reading those into the record.
Yes. Line number 2584, January.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point on the basis that this is cumulative. There's a record that's already been established with the exhibit. And to just require the officer to read the remainder is cumulative in my opinion.
All right, response from the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state's position is it is not cumulative. While the state recognizes it is an exhibit, it's also a summary exhibit that we heard testimony from the agent that this would aid in his testimony today, that he believes it would aid the jurors in understanding. While it is what's on the screen, so long as it's read as to what's appearing on the screen, the state's position is in no way is this cumulative evidence. So we would ask that the judge overrule that objection and allow us to move forward with testimony.
And Judge, briefly in response is that the exhibit is what it is, and it's clear for the jury to look at that and read that. It doesn't necessitate the prosecutor to go line by line over a massive exhibit.
I am going to sustain the objection in that I would find it be somewhat, well, it is cumulative to have a written version of all of the messages and then to simply have a witness read through all of the written messages when they're already being published and the jurors are all capable of reading them as well. I'll sustain that in that I just don't want to have the entire thing read into the record. I don't know that that's necessary, but if you want to have any time or assurance to make sure the jurors have read the messages and direct the witness to any of the specific messages that are contained in there, certainly you can go there, Ms. Blake, but just the wholesale reading of all the messages, I do find the objection is sustained.
Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, looking at the first one there, it appears to be a message from Lori sent to Audrey.
That's correct.
Can you tell us who, if you learned through the investigation, who Audrey Baratario is?
Audrey Baratario was a friend and associate of Chad Daybell.
And did you learn through the investigation how she came to be in contact with Lori?
Chad Daybell introduced her to Lori Vallow.
And when we look at that first message, is there something about that that initially caught your attention?
Yes, it's the line where Lori indicates to Audrey that she's excited to be able to talk about what we both know.
And then did you look at that in conjunction with the response from Audrey to Lori?
Yes, Audrey indicates states that she guesses Lori has talked to Chad. And so it's clear from this particular text string that there's a reference by Lori Vallow to Audrey Baratario about what Lori, Audrey, and Chad Daybell know.
And Your Honor, may I ask that the witness be handed a laser pointer if we have one available?
Yes, I do think we have one.
Thank you. And Agent Hart, if at any point that's helpful.
Okay.
That. And then was there some significance to these other messages in relation to those first messages?
Yes, mainly in the fourth line where it says by Lori to Audrey that she thinks it's fun to talk to someone who knows what's really going on. Again, a reference to something between the three of them.
And again, this was in January of 2019.
Correct.
If we move to the next slide, I'm going to pause to give the jurors a chance to look through that.
Yes.
And Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, we have the name Melanie Boudreau. Did you learn through the investigation who she is?
Yes, she is Lori Vallow's niece.
And there's a reference in that first email to someone named Brandon. Do you know who Brandon is?
Yes, these are text messages, not emails, but Brandon is Melanie's husband or soon to be ex-husband. They were in the process of separating and getting a divorce.
And there's also the name Al. Do you know who Al would be referencing?
Only by the content of the text. I have never met or spoken with Allie Bloomer or her husband.
And what caught your attention about these particular messages?
These messages and then the next two slides are a continuation of this text string, demonstrate several significant things that are relevant to this investigation.
And in the very last message, it appears to be a message from Chad to Lori.
Correct.
And what did that appear to be an indication Chad was going to do?
So during the investigation...
Objection, Judge. That was going to call for speculation.
Overruled.
During the investigation, we came to know that Chad Daybell purported to have the ability to assign an individual as being either dark or light, and he would give them a score. And Lori Vallow and others would seek Chad's visions as it related to assigning people as being either dark or light. And so this is one of the first references we see in the iCloud account where Lori Vallow is seeking from Chad Daybell, or Chad Daybell rather, offers that he will check Allie Bloomer and her husband, meaning he will see what their scores are.
And then looking at that first message, it references that Brandon is making me promise not to have you or Al around my house or kids. Do you know who that Al is?
Yes, that's Alex Cox, Lori's brother.
And then you had already indicated this next slide is a continuation. I'm just going to pause to give the jurors a chance to read through that. And when you looked at these messages, was there anything on these that stood out to you?
Yes, primarily in line 3000, where Chad Daybell responds back approximately 8 minutes later, giving Lori Vallow these scores. He assigns Allie Bloomer as being 4.1 dark, and her cop husband is a 3 dark. And so those are coming from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow in reference to this issue that's come up with Melanie Boudreau.
And if we look at the line 2996, is Lori passing that information along?
Yes, and this is a pattern that we see repeatedly, that Lori Vallow would solicit Chad Daybell's advice or visions. Chad Daybell would respond, and then Lori Vallow would disseminate that out to whoever was making that inquiry.
And if we move to the next slide, I believe you indicated this is also a continuation of that conversation.
Correct.
I'm just going to pause here to give the jurors a moment to look through that.
Yes.
When we look at these messages, if we start with the new one, there's a reference to checking for recording devices. Did anything about that catch your attention?
Yes.
And then did it catch your attention in reference to the following messages?
It
Or is it
did.
related?
It did. So subsequent to seeking those scores on Allie Bloomer and her husband, Lori Vallow then makes a request to Chad Daybell to clear Melanie Boudreau's house and also check it for recording devices. And so Chad Daybell responds that he'll do that and that he's having to break down some dark entries Brandon created and that he detects 3 listening devices. And that answer is then passed on directly from Lori Vallow to Melanie Boudreau, referencing Chad Daybell as Melanie Boudreau's father, and then verbatim passes on that message. So to me, this establishes once again.
Judge, I'm going to object. It's calling for speculation.
I'll overrule that. You can answer.
It establishes that the individuals within this group look to Chad Daybell as the supposed visionary who will give them these types of information.
And in these messages, when the request is made, Chad responds. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm turning to the next slide. I'm again going to pause to allow the jurors a moment to look through that.
Very well.
Agent Hart, when we look at the date on this message, can you read the date?
I can, July 13th of 2019.
Do you know when Charles Vallow was killed?
He was killed on July 11th of 2019.
So just 2 days prior to this message.
Correct.
During this time, was Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes.
Do you know who Adam, Leah, well, I'll stop there. Do you know who Adam is?
Yes.
And who is that?
Chad Daybell's son-in-law.
And do you know who Leah is?
Chad Daybell's daughter.
And do you know who Joe is?
Joe is also Chad Daybell's son-in-law.
What is it, outside of the date, what else about this message drew your attention?
There were a couple of things that I think are significant in this message. The first is this line where Chad Daybell says, "I feel she will be gone by then," which is a reference to the pending death of Tammy Daybell.
Judge, objection. That calls for speculation.
I'll strike that last part of the answers. Insufficient foundation.
Based on your investigation, who did you believe the she to be?
Tammy Daybell.
It calls for speculation. I'll renew my objection, Judge.
And Your Honor, I think based on his investigation, I'm asking who he believed this message to be referencing.
Judge, could we approach, please?
No, it's overruled, Mr. Pryor. Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Who did you believe the her to be?
Tammy Daybell.
Or I said her, but the word is actually she, the pronoun used, correct?
Correct.
Looking at the second to the last sentence, could you explain if there was anything about that that drew your attention?
Yes, it helps tie in the line, "I feel she will be gone by then," So Chad Daybell tells Lori Vallow that the Lord has hinted to him that he might not get to be with Lori Vallow until after this graduation ceremony takes place on July 23rd, and asks Lori Vallow to, quote, please ask about that.
If we turn to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read that. Agent Hart, looking at the date on this one, how many days ago had Charles been killed?
3 days prior.
And again, Tammy Daybell's still alive?
Yes.
Do you know, or did you learn through the investigation who Lily would be referencing?
Yes. Lily is another name for Lori Vallow.
Was there something about this that caught your attention?
There are two things about this communication that caught my attention.
Could you tell me what those were?
The first is the reference to joining Chad Daybell in the shower. They were physically, Lori Vallow was in Arizona, Chad Daybell was in Idaho at the time of this message. So there are repeated references to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell having the ability to connect on a spiritual plane and be together spiritually. So this is just one example of that, but it's pertinent because it happens repeatedly and it could be easily confused that they were actually physically present together, which they were not. So that was the first thing that stood out.
And what was the next thing?
The next thing is the last line of Chad Daybell's text to Lori Vallow, where he says he loves her so immensely that the whole universe knows it, and very soon the people on this little blue globe will know it too, which demonstrates that their relationship was clandestine or secret at this point, and that at some future date, the relationship between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow would be divulged by Chad Daybell.
And then moving to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors time to read that. Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, there is the name James and a name Elena referenced. Did you see those in this message?
Yes.
Were you able to determine through the investigation who James is referencing?
Yes, James is Chad Daybell.
And were you able to determine who Elena is referencing?
Yes, Elena is Lori Vallow.
And again, the date on these messages is how many days after Charles Vallow was killed?
This is now 3 days after he was killed.
What is it about these particular messages that drew your attention?
Well, the James and Elena communications are very significant, and we see them first in the email section of the iCloud, starting on July 8th, continuing through July 9th, and through much of July. Chad Daybell is the author of these portions of a narrative or a history that chronicles Chad Daybell's meeting Lori Vallow and how their relationship developed. He refers to himself as James in this and to Lori Vallow as Elena, but in fact, this is autobiographical. It is based in fact. We verified the facts of the story as being correct and accurate to real events. And so in this, we have a description from Chad Daybell as to how he met Lori, and particularly several important events that occurred early on in their relationship.
And in this first one, there's an indication now on with the story. Were there other segments that came before this next message?
Yes, and it's very voluminous. And so what we're seeing here were portions that were sent via text message by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow. But as I said, on July 8th is the first instance we see of a very lengthy narrative written by Chad Daybell, sent to Lori Vallow via email.
And again, during this time, Tammy Daybell is still alive?
She is.
In that second message, there's the indication they would both attend the same event in mid-November. Were you able to determine through the investigation if that occurred?
Yes, so that's a reference to November 15th through the 17th of 2018. So while this message was sent via text on July 14th of 2019, the narrative contained in the message is talking about a time period between the end of October and prior to November 15th through the 17th of 2018.
And the last sentence of that text, was there something that stood out there?
I think the entire text is pertinent, as well as that last sentence. In the middle, Chad Daybell states in this narrative that he and Lori Vallow had been married before, and references some past time with the Savior when he lived in Jerusalem. And Elena, or Lori, had been his beloved spouse and best friend. In the final line, he says that relationship was now meant to continue in this lifetime. So looking at this history, Chad is saying that after he met Lori Vallow, he knew that their relationship was now meant to continue in this lifetime, with the assertion that they had been married in a previous lifetime.
And again, you talked about, while this message is sent in July of 2019, that it's referencing events from 2018.
That's correct. Chad Daybell met Lori Vallow on October 26th of 2018 at a Preparing a People conference in St. George, Utah. That's chronicled in this history. In between their first meeting, there was a 3-week time period before they would physically meet again in Mesa, Arizona, November 15th through the 17th, 2018, at another Preparing a People conference. So the time period being referenced by Chad Daybell in this communication is that time period from the end of October 2018 until they meet again physically in November of 2018.
And when this is written, Charles and Tammy are still alive.
That is correct.
We go to the next one. And again, I'm going to pause here to let the jurors read it. And this message again has the date of July 14th of 2019, correct?
Yes, it does.
And could you talk a little bit about what it is about this message that caught your attention?
What caught my attention is that this is the first time Chad Daybell introduces to Lori Vallow the concept that they had lived as human beings at another time in the past, that they had been married to each other in the past, and that they were meant to be married again in this present time and complete these important missions together.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point, and I have voir dire native objection.
Well, there's no pending question at this time. So if there was an objection, Mr. Pryor, it just wasn't timely.
And again, Agent Hart, when we're seeing the James and Elena references and this story being drafted, it is referencing back to events that would have happened previously.
Yes, he is referencing events and phone conversations that took place between the end of October 2018 and just prior to November 15th through the 17th of 2018.
And again, when we're looking at this, Charles has been killed just 3 days before this message.
That's correct.
And in 2018, when this story's referencing back to 2018, Charles and Tammy were still alive.
Yes, Charles and Tammy were still alive. Lori Vallow was married to Charles Vallow, and Chad Daybell was married to Tammy Daybell during this time period that he's describing.
Judge, I'm going to object on response, or I'll actually, Judge, I'll withdraw at this point.
All right. Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
There's also a reference in there, the line starting with, he was ecstatic. Could you read that sentence in there?
He was ecstatic that she was receiving confirmation of these things as well.
Did that indicate anything to you?
Yes, in the first sentence, Chad writes that he tried to delicately describe their connection with one another and was in fact delighted when Lori Vallow believed him. And so this is Chad Daybell introducing these concepts of he and Lori having been married in a previous life.
And then later on, we see that she appeared to be getting confirmation of what Chad was telling her.
Correct.
There's also reference in there to physical desires.
Yes.
With the talk of physical desires, making love, was there anything about those that caught your attention?
Well, it demonstrated the attraction of Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow instantly upon their meeting in October of 2018.
If we move to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. When we look at these messages, they are also dated July 14th of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was it about these messages that caught your attention?
This is a communication by Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow, seeking an opportunity to be with her in person and using a camp out and a potential speaking assignment as a ruse to be able to leave Rexburg and go and be with Lori Vallow.
And there's a reference there in the first message, whether she is still here or not. Based on your investigation, did you determine who that she would have been referencing?
Tammy Daybell.
And in the James and Elena, we saw some reference to some kind of physical attraction. And then in these, what stood out is Chad and Lori are actually going to meet up in person here.
Yes, the investigation had revealed they had already met at several different times with travel to different places to be together for periods of 2 or 3 days. And in fact, we were able to verify that Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow did meet and were together during that July 24th through 26th timeframe that's referenced in the communication.
And July 24th to 26th, Tammy Daybell was still alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. And again, these are a continuation of text messages from July 14th of 2019.
Correct.
And again, just 3 days after Charles Vallow's been killed.
Yes.
What about these messages drew your attention?
There was a lot of what we call sexting content in the iCloud that I examined. I included these communications as just a very, very small example that this was, in fact, a sexual affair. It was not an emotional affair or a spiritual affair. It's very clear that it's a physical sexual affair between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
And moving to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read this. And if we look at these, can you indicate the date on these messages for the record?
July 15th of 2019.
So these are moving to the next day from the previous messages.
Correct.
What is it about these particular messages that caught your attention?
This is an example of how Lori Vallow sought to manipulate Chad Daybell in the immediate aftermath of Charles Vallow's death.
And in that text from Chad to Lori, could you read the last line?
He says, "You are my wonderful best friend that I can't live without."
And again, during this time, Tammy Daybell is still alive.
Correct.
And the manipulation that you're indicating is Lori's response there. Could you read the first line?
Yes, she replies, and yet you are so sad, missing you.
Referencing back to his message to her that he couldn't live without her.
Correct. Chad Daybell tells Lori Vallow how much he loves her and he can't live without her. And her response to that is, and yet you are, in fact, living without me. So sad.
And moving to the next slide, again, I will pause to allow the jurors to read. And could you indicate the date on these messages for the record?
July 18th of 2019.
What about these messages stood out to you?
Well, this is a series of texts that occupies this slide and the next 3 slides, all regarding the same subject, and that is Lori Vallow has just found out that she is not the beneficiary to Charles Vallow's $1 million life insurance policy.
And she's telling Chad that.
Correct.
Going to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And you indicated this is a continuation of the previous slide, correct?
Correct, as well as the next 2 slides.
In looking at this particular slide, there's a reference to bringing down the Gadiantons, especially Brandon.
Yes.
Through the investigation, did you determine who that Brandon would be that is being referenced?
That is Brandon Boudreau, Melanie Boudreau's soon-to-be ex-husband.
Through your investigation, did you learn anything in relation to Brandon and an investigation involving him?
Yes.
What did you learn?
What could you clarify? What did we learn about?
Yes, sorry. Did you learn anything about an incident being investigated by the Gilbert Police Department involving Brandon as a victim?
Yes.
And what did you learn regarding that?
On November 2nd of 2019, as Brandon Boudreau was pulling in his driveway of his home in Arizona, an individual shot at him with a rifle, narrowly missing him.
And you said November 2nd. Is it possible it was October 2nd?
I'm sorry, you are correct. It is October 2nd. Excuse me.
And that was October 2nd of 2019.
Correct.
Do you know, did the reference bringing down the Gadiantons mean anything, or did you learn what that was referencing?
I learned that that is a reference. The name Gadianton has to do with a group of people that's referenced in a book of scripture called the Book of Mormon. The Gadiantons were robbers and thieves, and so the word Gadianton is indicative of someone who is a thief or a robber or a bad individual.
And as Lori's telling Chad that she's no longer the beneficiary, can you read the last text into the record?
Yes, that's a text from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow. It says, it will be interesting if it got changed after he had 2 bullets in his chest.
And going to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, I think you indicated this is also a continuation from the previous 2 slides. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Were there some additional references on this particular slide that stood out to you, or particular statements?
Yes, primarily the last line.
And what was it about that that stood out to you?
That's a text from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell. And so she had found out that the beneficiary for the life insurance policy had been changed in March of 2019. And then she says, so it was probably Ned before we got rid of him. Ned is the name of the supposed dark entity that Chad Daybell had assigned to Charles Vallow.
And then there's a reference there before we got rid of him, correct?
Correct.
Did you learn what the $4,000 a month from SS was in reference to through the investigation?
Yes, that's a reference to money that would still be coming to Lori Vallow through Social Security for her children, primarily for JJ.
And then if we move to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read.
Very well.
And when we look at this slide, can you read the date on these messages into the record?
Yes, these 5 messages are all from July 21st of 2019.
We've talked about who Ned is. Through the investigation, did you learn who Rhonda is that's being referenced?
Yes, Rhonda is the name assigned to the dark spirit or dark entity that Chad Daybell assigned to Kay Woodcock.
Judge, I'm going to object on foundation.
Sustained.
Agent Hart, as part of your investigation, did you review other documents?
Many, yes.
Did you review other reports?
Yes.
Did you discuss this matter with other investigators?
Yes.
And based on your review in this case, did you determine who Rhonda was referencing?
Yes.
And who was
And I'm
that?
going to renew my objection, Judge. You can talk about all the reports you want, but unless they get into specifics, telling me how he came to that conclusion, which documents, when, where, and time, it's still not sufficient foundation.
For purposes of this direct, I do find there's sufficient foundation. I'll overrule the objection. You can cross on that, of course, Mr. Pryor, when it's your chance for cross-examination.
Who did you determine Rhonda to be referencing?
Kay Woodcock, who is Charles Vallow's sister.
Now, there's references in some of these messages as well to working on someone. Through your review of the iCloud and messages, did you determine anything in relation to those working on, or did that stand out to you?
Yes, this is a phrase that we see repeatedly in the iCloud, and it actually has a dual meaning. When they're referencing somebody who Chad Daybell has determined to have a dark spirit or a dark entity working on them, has a negative connotation. When it's someone who's determined to be light or good, then working on them is an uplifting or a building connotation.
Agent Hart, as we've reviewed some of these messages that were around or shortly after Charles' death, we're seeing some of them. In your review of the messages, did you ever see any signs of grief or sorrow from Lori Vallow?
No.
Did you ever see any signs of grief or sorrow from Chad Daybell?
None.
If we go to the next slide again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And would you read the date of this message into the record?
July 21st of 2019.
And we've talked about James and Elena before, and this story, again, it references a prior period of time than when the message was being sent. Is that correct?
Yes. So at this point in this narrative, the dates are, this would be November 15th of 2018.
And we saw a previous slide dealing with that same time frame. Is that correct?
The previous slides were actually talking about that period of time between the end of October and prior to November 15th of 2018. This particular story talks about when Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow are now physically together in Mesa, Arizona on November 15th of 2018.
And through the investigation, did you learn if Chad Daybell was in fact in Arizona in November of 2018?
Yes, we verified that he was present on that specific date. We verified that he spoke at a Preparing a People conference there during those dates of the 15th through the 17th of November 2018, and verified that he was physically present at other locations as well.
And outside of the continuation of the James and Elena, were there specific things in this message that drew your attention?
Yes.
What were those?
Primarily that there was a plan that had been revealed or communicated to Chad that wasn't entirely clear to him yet, but it included them, meaning Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, being together at the present time.
So specifically, the plan was being revealed to Chad.
Correct.
And there's a reference of Chad and Lori having a mission together.
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm again going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, these messages were also sent on July 21st of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes.
In looking at these particular messages, was there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, they're very insightful in that Chad, in his own words, is explaining the feelings he had for Lori Vallow within 3 weeks of meeting her, that they had progressed through this relationship. They had finally found their best friend that they could trust and confide in.
And again, the period of time this message is referencing, both Lori and Chad were married to other people.
Correct.
And Lori Vallow responded to this message. Can you read her response?
She loves it.
And there's the reference in there to the 3 weeks. And would this have been, was the meeting in November about 3 weeks after Chad and Lori met in real life?
Yes, that's verified.
Moving to the next message, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And would you read the date of this message into the record?
This is also July 21st of 2019.
And this is a continuation of the James and Elena story being written.
Yes.
Are you aware of which time period this message is referencing?
This is referencing a specific date of November 16th, 2019, or excuse me, 2018.
And was there something about this particular part of the story that drew your attention?
There were multiple things that drew my attention to this that I believe are pertinent to the investigation.
Can we go through those one by one?
Sure.
What is the first one that drew your attention?
So the first is that Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow went to an LDS temple that has been verified. They attended the temple in Gilbert, Arizona on November 16th of 2018 together. And that they then participated in a ceremony that is a proxy ceremony for marrying people who have already been deceased.
And again, that was verified that they were at that temple together.
Yes.
And they reference the proceeding. After that, there's an indication in here, if you can read from the James and Elena knew.
James and Elena knew that they were now sealed as husband and wife for eternity.
Did that line stick out to you?
Yes, this is Chad Daybell's writing stating that when he and Lori participated in this proxy ceremony, that somehow through that, they had become once again married for eternity.
And then if we go to the last sentence starting with they knew, would you read that into the record?
Yes. They knew they had just begun a new journey together that was eternal and never ending.
Was there something about that particular line that caught your attention?
Yes, this is the beginning of their relationship and continuation of that relationship in the coming months that encapsulate the time period of this investigation and the crimes that are alleged.
And if we go to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And these messages were also exchanged on July 21st of 2019. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And in looking at these messages, were there things that caught your attention?
Yes, two things primarily.
And can you walk us through those?
Yes. The first is that Lori Vallow responds to those prior clips that Chad wrote about James and Elena saying, "It's making me so happy to read about our life," which is a verification that this is an autobiographical or factual account.
And then what is the next thing?
The next is the line from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell, which says, "I love you more than ever. I can't wait to be with you forever. I'm begging father and mother. That's my job tonight." To which Chad Daybell responds, "I will be right beside you, begging just as much. I need you desperately."
And what, if anything, did that indicate to you about Chad and Lori's relationship?
That they had a clear plan to be with each other, to be together forever, and that they were both begging God for that to happen.
And again, when these messages are being exchanged, is Tammy Daybell still alive?
She is.
In your review of these iCloud accounts, was there ever any indication of Chad planning on getting a divorce?
None.
Ever any indication of Chad planning on getting separated?
No.
Moving to the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And could you please read the date of these messages into the record?
July 22nd of 2019.
You just talked about the previous slide indicating a plan to be together.
Correct.
What is it about these particular messages that stood out to you?
Again, there are a couple of different things that stood out as relevant. The first is the text from Chad Daybell to Lori Vallow referencing going to see a movie with Garth, who is his son. He then says, missing you desperately, but so excited to be with you. If you'll recall from a prior slide, there's a plan July 24th through the 26th for Chad and Lori to be meeting in person. And so the first line is a reference to their in-person meeting that's coming up.
And then looking at Lori's response, is there something in there that drew your attention?
Very much. She said, I love you. You will enjoy the scenery. Looks like Kauai a lot. And then responds with another text saying, hopefully we will be there someday soon together.
So there's a reference to Kauai.
Yes.
Do you know where Kauai is located?
Yes, it's in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands.
What's Chad's response to that?
Chad's response is significant. He says, that is the plan, exclamation point, and my greatest desire.
And then we talked about Kauai being in Hawaii. Looking at Chad's final sentence there of the last message, could you read that into the record?
Yes. I look forward to being on a tropical island with you.
I asked you earlier if you knew when Chad and Lori got married. Do you recall when that was?
November 5th of 2019.
Do you know where they got married?
I do.
Where was that?
Kauai.
Do you know where Chad and Lori relocated eventually after getting married?
Kauai.
During the time those messages are being exchanged, was JJ Vallow still alive?
He was.
Was Tylee Ryan still alive?
She was.
Was Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes, she was.
Moving to the next slide. Again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you read the date these messages were sent into the record?
July 26th of 2019.
Looking at these messages, did certain parts of them catch your attention?
Very much so, yes.
And what is it about them that caught your attention, if you can walk us through that?
Well, the time frame is important. So these messages were sent as Chad Daybell was returning home from having spent 2 or 3 days from the 24th through the 26th with Lori Vallow. So he references that he's just gotten home, back to his home in Rexburg, and that he had a splendid time with her. And then he follows up with a narrative or sentiment that he believes or feels that he's a grown-up version of Harry Potter who has to live with the Dudleys in a little space under the stairs. And then every few weeks he gets to escape and have amazing adventures with his goddess lover. The part that to me is most significant is the final sentiment where he says, then I have to return to my place under the stairs, feeling trapped. But I sense permanent freedom is coming, exclamation point.
You indicated he just returned from the weekend or from the time with Lori, correct?
Yes, these messages were sent upon his return back to his home in Rexburg.
So he's referencing being back home with his family. He feels trapped.
Correct.
Looking at the next slide, and again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, if you can read the date these messages were sent into the record.
July 28th of 2019.
What about these messages stood out to you?
There's a couple of things. This is in reference, just for context, to a trip that Lori Vallow was planning to take with Melanie Boudreau and Alex Cox to Southern California.
And in these, we see a message from Chad to Lori about no privacy here to hardly text. Do you happen to know where Chad would have been located at that time?
Judge, objection, foundation.
Sustain.
With these messages, was there any through your investigation, was there any indication that Chad Daybell was going on a trip?
No.
The indication was Lori Vallow was going on a trip.
Correct.
So based on your investigation, Chad wasn't leaving his home.
Correct.
Judge, objection. This is leading.
Well, it was, but it's already been asked and answered.
Then we see, looking at that third message on there, the text from Lori to Chad, is there something about that drew your attention?
Yes, this is approximately 2 weeks after Lori Vallow's husband, Charles Vallow, has been killed. She is now free from her marriage. Chad Daybell is not free from his marriage. And she says, I need a distraction while I'm waiting for you. And he replies, absolutely, I think you'll have a fun time.
And turning to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to look at these. And
Counsel, could I have a quick sidebar?
yes.
All right, thank you, counsel. That last exhibit, I'll ask if the state would redact certain information off of that, and I'll permit time to do that. In addition, the court had previously discussed with counsel our scheduling for today, given that it's Friday and we've been through a long week. I'm going to suggest we break for the day. We have advised the jurors previously we might be stopping early today. Ms. Blake, is this a good time for us to break until Monday?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Any objections from the defense?
No objection, Judge. Thank you.
All right, that will conclude evidence for this week. All right, thank you. Agent Hart, you are still under oath for purposes of your testimony. That oath was given last week. In addition, I'll just inquire over the weekend or since you were on the stand, have you reviewed any of this trial that's been is available online and has been live streamed? Have you reviewed any of the testimony of the trial?
No, Your Honor.
All right. With that then, Ms. Blake, you can continue on your direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I do have a modified slide, a courtesy copy for the court and one for Your Honor as well. Or one for the court and one for Your Honor. Defense has already been provided one. And Your Honor, this is part of State's Exhibit 183. May I publish that exhibit?
Yes, and just to be clear, the identifier information's been redacted on what's going to be published.
Correct, Your Honor.
Yes, you may publish.
Agent Hart, we were here last Friday and we had been talking about some texts exchanged regarding Charles' death. Do you recall that?
I do.
And do you recall talking about the beneficiary in relation to Charles' death?
Yes, there had been a series of text messages between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell that indicated Lori Vallow had found out that her husband, Charles Vallow, had changed the beneficiary of his life insurance policy.
And the images on this slide, is that what we're seeing here?
Well, previously there were text messages, and then approximately 2 weeks, 10 days later, Lori Vallow sent 2 MMS messages to Chad Daybell on July 28th of 2019. The one on the left is the original life insurance policy that shows Lori Vallow, his spouse, as the beneficiary to receive 100% of the proceeds of that policy. And this one over here shows the change in beneficiary to Ella K. Woodcock and the date that that was done.
And do you know who Ella K. Woodcock is in relation to Charles Vallow?
It's his sister.
And do you know who she is in relation to JJ Vallow?
She would be JJ's grandmother.
And again, these messages were sent to Chad Daybell.
By Lori Vallow, correct.
And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to pause here and allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, when we look at these messages, we'd talked before, there were additional messages in the iCloud account. Is that correct?
There are thousands of text messages in the iClouds, yes.
And with these particular messages, were there some preceding messages in relation to these?
Chronologically, yes, there were.
And when we're looking at these messages, do you know who the Mel is that's being referred to?
Yes, that's Melanie Boudreau, Lori Vallow's niece.
And what was it about these particular messages that caught your attention?
What caught my attention was the conflict that existed between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell as it relates to their relationship. At this point, Charles Vallow has been dead for almost a month, and Lori Vallow wants her and Melanie Boudreau to travel to Rexburg, Idaho to spend time with Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell is, of course, still married to Tammy Daybell, and so that
It's sustained.
So you were indicating that Melanie Boudreau and Lori were wanting to go to Rexburg to visit Chad.
correct.
And can you read the date on these messages into the record?
The date of this text string is August 7th of 2019.
And then at the bottom, are there some that carry into the next day?
Correct, August 8th of 2019.
During this time, do you know if Tammy Daybell was still alive?
She was.
So in this context, it appears that Lori's telling Melanie, we just had a big fight. Do you know who that's in reference to?
That's in reference to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
And at this time, Charles has been dead for not quite a month.
Correct.
What else about these stood out to you?
There's a conflict between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell regarding.
I think there's inadequate foundation at that point. Mr. Pryor, moving forward on your objections, please use the microphone. Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Agent Hart, again, you've talked about you went through thousands of messages in this iCloud account, or that there were thousands of messages, correct?
Yes.
Were there some messages preceding this indicating what Chad's plans were during this time?
Yes.
And what did those messages indicate?
Chad Daybell had a.
All right, again, into the microphone, please, Mr. Pryor, or maybe your mic's not on today, but. Okay, could we get that checked, please, to make sure the microphone is functioning at defense table?
So if I remember, this is 6. This is 30.
Okay, apologies. Ms. Blake, would you ask another question? I'll defer ruling on that objection. Go ahead.
Agent Hart, did you review messages that indicated what Chad's plans were during this time frame?
Yes, it's a scheduling conflict. Lori Vallow wanted to visit Chad Daybell.
Judge, I'm going to object. It's unresponsive.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Well, I'll sustain the objection because the answer was what Chad's plan. The question was what were Chad's plans, and the answer was what Lori Vallow wanted. I think that's outside the scope of the question and the foundation that's been laid. So it's non-responsive.
You determined that Chad Daybell had different plans during this time?
Judge, objection. That's leading.
Your Honor, he's already answered that.
Overruled.
Yes, he had a family vacation planned.
So in reference to the big fight, based on your investigation, were you able to determine what this text thread was about?
Yes.
And what did you determine the fight to be about?
Lori Vallow's trip, which conflicted with Chad Daybell's family vacation.
And when we look at those last 3 messages, did anything about those catch your attention?
From the content of the iCloud, this was the first big fight they had had. And it appeared that they were at odds with one another. And Chad Daybell's comments was that his heart was crushed and he would never stop loving her.
And if we go to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date of these text messages?
Yes, it's towards the end of the day on August 8th of 2019.
Is this a continuation from the conversation we saw on the previous slide?
Correct.
In looking at this, was there something that stood out to you?
Yes.
And what was that?
If you look at the date and the time, you can see that Lori Vallow has ceased to communicate with Chad Daybell for approximately a day. And this lengthy text, line 1300, is a very clear example of how Chad Daybell used his supposed visionary powers to manipulate Lori Vallow.
Judge, I'm going to object. Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
And in this, sorry, let me back up. In that first message as well from Chad to Lori, can you read the second sentence of that?
Saddest day of my life.
And again, you indicated Lori had quit communicating with him after the previous message that we saw.
That's correct. So there had been no communication from Lori Vallow to Chad Daybell on August 8th of 2019.
And after Chad sends that lengthy text, it appears Lori resumes communication. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you read into the record what she said?
I love you.
And then Chad responds just,
thank you, my love. I will get things restored.
so in that lengthy one, he indicated that he may not be able to protect her anymore.
Correct. Grandpa Keith is Lori's deceased grandfather. So Chad Daybell is indicating to Lori Vallow that he is unable to protect her and that the angels are angry that she is ignoring him. And so he is trying to get her to respond due to those indication of what's happening spiritually.
And then once she does respond, Chad will get things restored.
That's what he indicates, yes.
Then if we move to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And will you indicate the date this message was sent?
This is August 10th of 2019.
And what about this particular message stood out to you?
Well, I think this is an example of how Lori Vallow manipulates Chad Daybell.
And this image was sent along with the surprises or waiting text. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, on August 10th, is Tammy Daybell still alive?
Yes.
Moving to the next slide, and again, I'll pause to allow the jurors to read. And if you could read into the record the date these messages were sent.
These are August 10th of 2019.
So these would have been sent after that image that we saw in the previous slide.
Correct.
What, if anything, about these caught your attention?
There had been several messages preceding these two messages indicating their ability to connect spiritually, to enter into portals, to be together outside the physical realm. What stood out to me about these two messages is that both Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell understand that's not real and it's not true. Lori Vallow says, I wish you were really here to experience this with me. And again, saying, I wish I could wake up and kiss your sweet, tender lips for real. So to me, that indicated an understanding between being together truly in the physical realm in which we live versus this alleged ability to portal and be with one another spiritually.
And if we go to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. Can you indicate the date these messages were sent into the record?
Yes, this is August 11th of 2019.
And what about these particular messages caught your attention?
These 4 messages are the beginning of a text string that occupies this slide and the next 5 slides. And it's a lengthy back and forth between Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow regarding a vacation that Chad Daybell is going on with his wife, Tammy Daybell, and other relatives.
And in relation to that trip, can you read the last sentence of that first text?
Partly why I am so sad is my Boise trip has turned into a trip with extended family. Not happy about it.
And then if we move down to that third message, was there something about that that caught your attention?
Well, these are Chad Daybell's own words. He says, I can't take much more, so trapped. So it's an indication of how he's feeling as it relates to his current situation as it existed on August 11th of 2019.
We move to the next slide, and I'll pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, you indicated this is a continuation from the previous slide. Is that correct?
Yes.
What about these messages caught your attention?
First of all, the date caught my attention. This is 1 month to the day after Charles Vallow had been killed, and approximately 10 months into the relationship between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Subsequent to Charles Vallow's death, the pressure being put by Lori Vallow on Chad Daybell for them to be together increased significantly. And so you see in these messages that Lori Vallow is asking, is that what he wants, for me to sit around waiting for you endlessly and you miserably wasting time? It doesn't feel right. And so these messages are a good indication of their thoughts as it relates to their ability to be together in the current circumstances that they find on that date.
And in that first message, Chad refers to it as torture.
Referring to the 2 days he's going to spend with his family as torture, yes.
And you indicated Charles Vallow's been dead for about a month, correct?
Exactly 1 month.
But Tammy's still alive.
Yes, she is.
And moving to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, you indicated this is also a continuation from the previous two slides. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
When you look at these particular messages, what stood out to you?
Again, it's a clear communication between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell regarding the status of their relationship and Lori Vallow's desire to be together overtly with Chad Daybell.
And when we look at the last message, the response from Chad to Lori, can you read that into the record?
Yes. Oh, honey, that is so crushing. I feel so destroyed inside. You know my love for you is deep and real. I want change. I'm constantly begging for change. I want you. Nothing else matters. But I am hindering your life and you deserve better. I love you so intensely.
And at this point in time, again, Charles died 1 month ago, correct?
Yes.
But Tammy's still alive.
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, again, I'll pause to allow the jurors to read. Agent Hart, on that previous slide, we'd seen that Chad was begging for change so he could be with Lori. Is that correct?
Yes.
What would need to change so he and Lori could be together?
Judge, objection calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Agent Hart, when we look at this slide, is it a continuation from the last several slides?
Yes.
And it's still on August 11th of 2019?
That's correct.
What about these messages stood out to you?
This demonstrates Lori Vallow's impatience for this plan that I've testified to previously about the life they want to live, where they want to live it, and their plans to be together and conduct missions together. And so Lori wants that to happen. And that can't happen while Tammy Daybell is still married to Chad Daybell.
And again, to remind the jurors, in these messages, did you ever see any indication that Chad was intending to divorce Tammy?
Never.
Did you ever see any indication that Chad was intending to separate from Tammy?
No.
If we go to the next slide, again, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read it. And again, Agent Hart, this is a continuation from the previous slides. Is that correct?
It is.
What about these particular messages stood out to you?
Previously, on August 8th of 2019, when this conflict about Chad Daybell's family vacation came up, we saw the text message about Grandpa Keith and that the Angels were angry that Lori Vallow was ignoring Chad Daybell. The middle line of this text is a reference to that exchange that occurred 3 days previously, where Lori Vallow is now asking Chad Daybell, are you going to threaten me that I'm unprotected for putting Chad Daybell aside? And his response is absolutely not. I'm so upset at the circumstances. I'm demanding they protect you more than ever. So this was a tie back to the August 8th conversation with Chad Daybell.
And again, an indication that Chad Daybell can provide some form of protection.
Correct.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, is this also a continuation from the previous slides?
Correct. This is the final slide for this text string.
And with this one, if we break it down a little bit, looking specifically at that second text from Chad to Lori, are there certain things in that text that stood out to you?
Absolutely.
What were those?
The first is, it's mainly the second sentence. We are surrounded by telestial relatives that are simply obstacles.
Do you know what the reference telestial relatives would be in relation to? Or actually, let me back up. Through your investigation, did you learn or determine what telestial relatives would be referencing?
Yes.
What did you learn that to be?
The word telestial derives from the LDS faith. It is the lowest level or degree of glory or heaven. And then there are levels above that. So it's a reference to the lowest level of heaven as it's perceived.
And the specific word next to that is relatives.
Yes.
And these telestial relatives are being described as simply obstacles.
Correct.
And then what did Chad say regarding that? What's that next sentence, if you could read it into the record?
I'm so sick of it! Exclamation point.
And there's a response from Lori, but then looking down to the last message from Chad back to Lori, anything about that one that stood out to you?
There's a couple of things that stood out in that last sentence, yes.
And could we go through those one by one?
Yes.
What is the first one?
Chad Daybell states very clearly what his greatest desire is. I want to be with you. That is my greatest hope and dream.
And again, during this time, Tammy Daybell's still alive?
She is.
What else about this message stood out to you?
The last sentence is telling in my mind. I would happily join you tomorrow if it felt like heaven would not strike us down.
Your Honor, I have no additional questions at this time.
All right, thank you, Ms. Blake. Counsel, in reference to cross-examination and potential exhibit, I wanted to update counsel on that outside the presence of the jurors. So let's take a brief sidebar at this moment. All right, we're back on the record after a sidebar with counsel. It's a little earlier than we would normally do this, but what we're going to do is take our mid-morning break at this time in order to get some exhibits properly before the jury, before cross-examination, which will take a few moments. So we'll use that time to allow the jurors to take a break. I'll go on the record with counsel before we bring the jurors back in at the end of the break to make any other additional evidentiary rulings that would occur outside the presence of the jurors. And then once we've concluded that, we should have the morning set up for continued cross-examination and evidence until we get to lunch. So with that in mind, let's take our mid-morning break at this time.
All right, please.
Thank you. Please be seated. All right, we're back on the record without the jurors present at this time. Take up the matter of some exhibits. The issue being that one of the exhibits needed a redaction and other exhibits had some editorial type commentary on them that the court ruled would not be permitted as part of the exhibits. So those were also altered. And so let's just start with the state's exhibit 183. That was on Friday, and it was noted when we stopped for the day that there was some personal identifier information that needed to be redacted. That was redacted, and the information was not published to the jury. But in terms of marking or tracking the redacted exhibit, what does the state suggest in terms of a new replacement exhibit or just noting on the record a redaction on the admitted exhibit?
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would request that we just note that the redaction was made. The state actually never ended up submitting the original 183 because that was caught prior to us finishing with that PowerPoint presentation. So I talked to Madam Clerk and let her know that we were going to go ahead and get it modified. So the exhibit that's actually been entered into the record is the 183 with the redaction. So I think if we could just make a clear record that it's been admitted with the redaction versus the 183 that was previously admitted that wouldn't have had the redaction, if that makes sense, that may be the easiest way to do it. And the jump drive submitted to the court does have that correction.
Okay. From the defense, any objection to handling the exhibit that way?
No, Judge. And the state provided me all of the redactions, so that's acceptable.
Okay, so I'll put that on the record then. Exhibit 183 now admitted, and what was published and what will be provided to the jurors has the redacted personal identifier information from those screenshots on insurance applications or forms. So that will resolve 183. On Exhibit 6, that was previously admitted, and the commentary, which was not part of the content of the exhibit other than labeling of certain parts of the exhibit, has been removed from those exhibits. I guess I'm looking for how the parties wish to handle that Exhibit 6, and it's also going to be Exhibit 7 also, defense Exhibit 6 and 7. Do we want to strike from the record those already admitted exhibits and admit substitute exhibits? Mr. Pryor, what's your suggestion on that?
Judge, I've prepared substitute exhibits, so I would move to strike those three and judge it 6, 7, and 32, which are all by stipulation. I've prepared substitute exhibits. I've had given the state the opportunity to review those in their entirety. So I have 6, 7, and 32. So I would move to strike 6 and 7. I'll substitute 6 and 7 in with the additional one, and then move for 32 as well.
I think 32, we're looking at our records. I don't know that that one was yet admitted.
I don't think so, Judge, but I may have referenced it, but I don't think I admitted it at this point.
Okay, well, if 32 is not yet admitted, then we don't have an issue there. What will be admitted will have the proper labeling. On 6 and 7, I guess my suggestion is going to be we would strike them and maybe relabel the new submitted ones, since exhibits were already admitted, and call them 6A and 6B. Is there any objection to us giving them a new designated name, or do you think it's more clear to just note the changes on the exhibits after admission?
Your Honor, from the state's perspective, I believe that both 6 and 7 have multiple subparts that are labeled within the discs as 6A, 6B, and subsequent, and I think 7's the same. So because of that, I'm not sure if labeling them 6A and 7A would, I think it may create some confusion for the record. So I don't know if we could simply strike the other ones and just resubmit them as 6 and 7, but
okay,
we'll leave it to the court's discretion.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. So that makes more sense to me also then. So just to be clear on the record, 6 and 7 were previously admitted. They were not yet published to the jurors. They were altered in that the descriptive language within those exhibits has been removed. So the contents are the same. The descriptions are not there any longer. So 6 and 7, as originally submitted, are removed from the record, and these 6 and 7 exhibits will come in now with the proper identifiers and just simply replace what was admitted. So we'll watch for that as things move along, counsel. I think there's a few other exhibits that are going to require the same treatment that have maybe not yet been admitted, and my staff attorney will assist in identifying those along the way if counsel hasn't. So I think with that, then we're ready to proceed with those evidentiary issues resolved. Anything further before we move on to cross from the state?
Not from the state, Your Honor. Thank you.
Judge, just that if I could have the original 6 and 7 that were struck and have them returned to me, I would appreciate it, Judge.
Okay, if we do have those, we'll get those out of our court records back to defense counsel, and then we will make a diligent effort before deliberations that whatever of these digital files go in for deliberations are only the correct exhibits that were admitted during trial. So with that, we're ready to bring the jurors back in. Let's have them return, and we'll commence with the defense cross of the witness.
All right, ladies. Strike out the things on. Stand up. Please operate the counter for you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Please be seated. All right, we've returned from our mid-morning break. We've sorted out the evidentiary issues we had on the record outside the jury's presence. Jury's returned at this time. Agent Hart remains on the stand, still under oath for testimony. The state concluded direct. So at this time, Mr. Pryor, if you'd like to conduct cross-examination, you can do so.
And permission to approach the podium, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, Agent Hart.
Morning.
Now, would you prefer I refer to you as agent? You're retired FBI agent, is that right?
I am retired. That's correct.
Is it your preference to be called chief deputy, or would you prefer agent?
Agent's a little less of a mouthful, so that's fine.
And then I'll take your suggestion and refer to you as agent, if that's okay. As part of your investigation, you went over thousands of messages. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Tens of thousands of messages?
Yes.
Okay. A significant amount.
Correct.
And you put together a summary of what you thought were relevant messages, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about who some of these messages were sent to, who received some of these messages. Obviously, you spoke in great detail about messages from Chad Daybell. Is that right?
Correct.
And Lori Vallow.
Yes.
Melanie Gibb?
No, Melanie Boudreau.
Well, did you ever have any that you reviewed from Melanie Gibb?
There are messages between Lori Vallow and Melanie Gibb in the iCloud that I have reviewed. Yes.
Okay, so there were messages that were involved with Melanie Gibb as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did any of these folks use other names in speaking with themselves, referring to others?
Can you clarify? Do you mean that
So,
names other than
nicknames.
themselves?
Nicknames. Lori Vallow use any nicknames?
Yes.
What nicknames did Lori Vallow use?
For others or for herself?
For herself and when others responded to her.
She would be called Lolo. She would be called Lily. Chad Daybell referred to her as Elena. And then there were numerous nicknames for her contacts that she had within the iCloud.
Okay, and then as far as Melanie Gibb, do you recall the nickname that Melanie Gibb used?
For herself?
For herself, yes.
I'm sorry, I don't recall that.
Okay. If I mention the word Phoebe, does that ring a bell?
Phoebe rings a bell, but I couldn't say definitively that that's associated with Melanie Gibb.
Okay. And if I were to show you a text message that referenced Phoebe to Lori Vallow, would that refresh your recollection?
It may.
Okay. We'll get to that in a minute. Other nicknames, other people, Alex Cox, did he have any nicknames?
Al was the most common one.
Okay. Melanie Boudreau?
Mostly Mel.
Okay. Anybody else you can think of?
Lori Vallow referred to Chad Daybell frequently as Bubby, Bubby.
Okay. Anything else?
Not that I would classify as nicknames. There were several occasions where others were assigned names by Chad Daybell, but I wouldn't call those nicknames.
Okay. Okay. Now, if I could have Elmo put up, Madam Clerk.
What are we going to put on the Elmo?
Judge, I'm going to ask the officer to go back to
Referencing 183.
183, Judge.
All right. 183 has been admitted. So, and Mr. Pryor's mentioned before, there's a light and zoom feature on that Elmo for clarity. And there's a light there as well somewhere. There's a light switch that gets rid of the shadow. There you go. Thank you.
Wouldn't make it without any help, Judge, I promise you. So I want to start towards the end of what we talked about. And you talked about your analysis of this particular discussion or chain of text messages. And this is from the Lolly time at iCloud, Lori Vallow, right?
Correct.
And the last line, I want you to read 824 again for me.
Of course. I want to be with you. That is my greatest hope and dream. I would happily join you tomorrow if it felt like heaven would not strike us down.
And you interpreted this in what way?
I don't believe I interpreted it at all during my testimony. I read it into the record on direct.
Okay. Well, I'm a bit curious. I want to be with you. That's Chad responding that he wants to be with Lori Vallow, right?
Correct.
It's my greatest hope and dream. He wants to have a relationship with her, right?
Yes, I mean, they've been in a 10-month relationship at this point, but I think he
Okay.
wants that relationship to be overtly known to everyone.
Okay. And you said a 10-month relationship. So 8/11 of 2019. I go back 10 months, and that puts me right to October 31st, give or take a few days. So is it your testimony? You said 10 months. Is it your testimony that that relationship started immediately on October 31st, the first time they met?
Essentially, yes.
Okay. So they were in a physical relationship from the first time they met?
No, I testified that their physical relationship began the second time they met in person, which would have been November 15th through the 17th of 2018.
And your interpretation of what that physical relationship in 2 weeks later was what? What type of physical relationship they have 2 weeks later?
Chad Daybell wrote about it in great detail. They were kissing, fondling each other, in bed with each other, taking each other's clothes off.
Okay. And that, are you referring to the Jack and the Elena story? Is that what you're referring to?
James and
James
Elena.
and Elena. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I said Jack. James and Elena. Excuse me. You're talking about the James and Elena story, right?
Correct.
And you know what Chad Daybell does for a living, right?
I do.
He's an author.
Yes.
He writes books about experiences that people have, whether religious or otherwise, right?
Yes.
And with every author, there's a little bit of exaggeration or artistic creativity whenever you're writing books. Would you agree with me?
If it's nonfiction, I would agree with you.
Okay. And you also know that this James and Elena was really a book in the making by Chad Daybell about his relationship with Lori Vallow, right?
I wasn't aware that it's a book in the making. No.
Okay. So this was just him taking doing a literary exercise, just writing about his relationship with Lori Vallow, not for the purpose of doing anything with it, just writing about this and making notes using different names, right?
I believe it's a truthful and accurate story.
Okay. Okay. A truthful and accurate story that you're putting down in writing about a relationship you're having with a woman, right?
Yes.
With some artistic creativity applied to it, correct?
I'll agree.
Okay. Now, did you, as part of your investigation, go back and look at some of Chad Daybell's writings?
We had someone in the investigative group do that. I've had some limited exposure to Chad Daybell's other writings, but I was not the individual who did an extensive analysis of those.
Okay. Are you aware that Chad Daybell made a habit of at least vaguely touching on some of his personal experiences when he wrote books?
It's my understanding that a couple of his books were about his prior experiences in his life.
And one of his books was about his daughter, Emma. In fact, the very book mentions the name Emma in the book, doesn't it not?
I couldn't tell you the title of the book, but I believe that's correct.
So it wouldn't have been particularly unusual for him, given his past about writing about his past experiences, to put together a book or a novel about a relationship he was having with Lori Vallow, correct?
Correct. I think the James and Elena story is about his relationship with Lori Vallow.
And it wouldn't be unusual, like in his other books, to maybe provide some artistic creativity as far as the facts are concerned, right?
It would depend on which facts you're talking about.
Okay. So what you're saying to me is that if the facts are helpful to the prosecuting attorney, he's not making it up.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Move to strike.
Sustain.
You don't know which facts are creative in this story that he was writing Lori Vallow, do you?
I know that we were able to vet and verify an extensive number of facts from that story.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you whether the explicit sexual detail is accurate or not, but
Okay.
the other elements are accurate.
Okay. So when we go back to this lolly time that's up on the board here and showing us, the last line is, I would happily join you tomorrow if it felt like heaven would not strike us down. You see that line?
I do.
Okay. And you said you didn't offer any explanation as to what that meant.
On direct, I did not.
Okay. And that was on August 11th of 2019.
That's correct.
And it talks about heaven would strike us down
It
in
does.
regards to the relationship.
Say again.
Well, it's in regards to the relationship, because I will happily join you tomorrow if it felt like heaven would not strike us down. That's what that says, isn't it?
It does.
Okay, so that has nothing to do with murder, does it?
I don't know that I could say entirely that it doesn't.
Okay. Does it have anything to do with the fact that maybe Mr. Daybell felt he couldn't divorce his wife, Tammy?
I don't know whether that's what that's in reference to or not.
Could it have anything to do with the possibility that Chad Daybell, as this so-called visionary who gets these premonitions, wouldn't leave his wife, Tammy, until his premonition came true that she would pass away?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the evidence or the prior testimony.
Overruled.
You can answer that, officer.
Again, I don't know what was in Chad Daybell's mind as it relates to why heaven would strike him down if he joined Lori Vallow at that point.
Okay. Tens of thousands of text messages, right?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't see in any of these, and if you have them in the other 10,000 that you went through, show me the one that says, hey, this is Chad. Let's kill the kids.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative and tries to put evidence not in fact.
Overruled.
Facts not in evidence.
Well, it's question on cross. It's overruled.
Show me the text. It says, let's kill the kids.
Well, that is argumentative, Mr. Pryor. If you want to ask if there's a text, that would be different.
Is there a text that says, let's kill the kids?
There are several texts that talk in detail about the deaths of those two children. Yes.
Oh, well, in detail about the deaths and what happened during their deaths, right? Not let's kill the kids, are there?
Wait a minute. What do you mean what happened during their...
What I'm saying is that there's references to Tylee and JJ throughout text messages, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But there is not a text message that says, let's kill the kids, is there?
There are text message in those specific words, no, but certainly alluding to and planning for the deaths of Tylee and JJ, yes.
Okay. And what in reference to how they're planning to kill the kids, why don't you talk to me a little bit about that? What exactly did you come across that says, let's plan on killing the kids?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the testimony and it's argumentative.
That is sustained.
Okay. You just made reference to the fact that there are text messages that talk about the planning of killing these kids, right?
Correct.
What text messages are you referring to?
There are several text messages between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell that refer to a plan to take the children and Chad Daybell's ability as a supposed visionary to understand when that might happen.
Okay. Okay. So there's no specific text message that talks about we're going to kill the kids and live happily ever after, is there?
I would disagree. Contextually, I think that's the meaning of those texts.
Okay. So in other words, you're interpreting those texts how you think they should be understood, right?
Well, those texts talk about the deaths, using the word death of Tylee and JJ. It talks about their death percentage, and both Tylee and JJ ended up being murdered. So If that's context, then that's the conclusion I draw, yes.
Okay, so what you're referring to are the text message where a numeric number was assigned to particular children about death percentages, correct?
Assigned by Chad Daybell, yes.
Right. Now, we talked a little earlier, and that's why I'm leading into this with you. And you could probably help me a little bit. My recollection is you were talking something about Allie Bloomer, right?
Yes, that's the second slide.
Okay. Well, it's actually the third slide, isn't it?
Oh.
Can you go to the third one? You threw me off, right?
It starts on the second slide, and then it continues to the third slide.
So you talked about the fact that because Chad Daybell put a numeric number on the children, that was the reason they were killed, right?
No, I wouldn't state it that way, that was the reason they were killed.
Okay. That supported your theory that they were killed because they were put a dark number on them, right?
I believe the dark number provided the justification for them to carry out those acts.
Okay. Okay, so when we go down to line 3000, would you read that one for me, the first two sentences?
Yes. Allie Bloomer is 4.1 dark. Her cop husband is 3 dark.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, are Allie Bloomer and her husband dead?
To my knowledge, they are not.
Okay. So when you assign a number dark, explain this. I mean, you probably know better than I do. Is this something that's part of the LDS faith?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Is there a reference in the LDS faith to light and dark?
Light and dark. Yes, there's reference throughout the Bible and the LDS faith to light and dark.
So if there was previous testimony by someone who suggested that light and dark is not part of the LDS faith, they're either mistaken or they're not being truthful. Would that be fair?
I don't think light and dark, as assigned by Chad Daybell, is part of the LDS faith.
That's not what I asked you, sir, and I appreciate you answering that way. What I asked you is that there is light and dark in the LDS faith, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Overruled.
Okay. It's overruled. There's a light and dark in the LDS faith, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're talking about is that there's a numeric system here. Is that what you're telling me? That Mr. Daybell's using?
There is a numeric system that Mr. Daybell is using.
Okay. And you've never seen this with anybody else ever putting a numeric system on light and dark, correct?
I have not.
Okay. Okay. And Allie Bloomer and her cop husband are not dead, right? To your knowledge?
To my knowledge, they are not.
Okay. So do you know how this dark numbering system works? Is high good or is low good, or how does that work on the dark spectrum?
From what I've been able to decipher based on my participation in the investigation, the higher the number, the worse it is.
Okay. So if you're a 1 dark, that you're better off being a 1 dark than you are being a 4 dark, right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. All right. Judge, could I have exhibits 6 and 7?
Yes, I'll have the bailiff bring those over.
And if you could just bear with me. While I'm waiting this to warm up a little bit, we'll move on and talk about a couple of other topics while I'm. It talked about manipulation, right? From both Chad and Lori.
Yes.
Now,
Mr. Pryor, just on the exhibit you've got continually being published there, if you're done with that, would you remove it from being published?
now, your testimony is that you felt that Chad was using his religious knowledge or beliefs to manipulate Lori Vallow, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So he was suggesting that because he has so much insight that he's with these religious insights that he's able to convince Lori Vallow to stay with him because he has religious insight. Is that correct?
He was looked to as the visionary for this small group. And in that capacity, yes, used that to keep Lori Vallow in a relationship with him.
And the small group you're talking about, who did you discover was in this small group?
The inner circle is really a trio of Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow, and Alex Cox.
Anybody else?
That's what I would refer to as the inner circle. There were others that were more peripheral.
Okay. And when you say more peripheral, shared some of the same religious views that Chad Daybell has.
Yes, I would describe them as adherents to Chad Daybell's doctrines.
How many of those do you talk about that are peripheral people that were adhering to it?
Six to 10.
Okay. Would Melanie Gibb be included in that group?
Yes.
David Warwick?
Yes.
Zaluma Pastenes?
Yes.
Okay. Melanie Boudreau?
Yes.
So this wasn't a large group of people then.
No, Chad Daybell spoke at a lot of conferences and those were larger, but I can't speak to how his message was received by those people.
And when you say Chad Daybell spoke at these conferences, you touched on it a little before that maybe Lori Vallow wasn't believing everything that Chad was saying about this religious stuff, right?
No, I don't believe I said that. I do believe she believed
Okay.
pretty much everything that Chad Daybell said.
Okay. And maybe what you testified to is that you questioned the accuracy of it in one of the text messages that you put up on the board. Do you recall saying something about that? No?
I don't, if you can direct me to this particular message.
So Chad Daybell started writing these books well before she ever met Lori Vallow. He met Lori Vallow, correct?
Yes.
And he wrote these books about his experiences and about his theories and interpretation of what he felt was the teachings of the LDS faith, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Introduces facts, not an evidence. I believe counsel's testifying.
Sustained.
Well, he wrote a lot of books about religious issues, correct?
Yes, I think most of his books had to do with kind of an end of times theme.
And he would go on these various go to various places and speak about his books and try to sell books.
Correct.
This was sort of a way to market or to make a living by talking about various religious feelings about religion, and then he'd go on and speak to people, and then in the meantime try to make a living or try to make money selling these books to people, right?
Yes.
And the predominant audience that he would go to, these encampments, these gatherings, these various locales, for the most part, they were centered around Utah, correct?
No, I mostly, well, St. George, Mesa, there was one in Boise.
Right.
So
Well,
the Intermountain West.
And you beat me to the punch because I was about to start with Utah, then say Arizona, then say Idaho. But you know, the predominant audience that these books were marketing to were people in Utah, Arizona, Idaho, correct?
That's where he spoke, yes.
And they were predominantly marketed to people of the LDS faith, right?
I think so.
And they were marketed to the people who would want to go to these various seminars about preparing for the end of time, right?
Yes.
And these people weren't all members of a cult, were they?
Not to my knowledge.
And there were various audiences who would show up and listen to Chad Daybell talk and sell his books, right?
Yes.
So the fact that he has Lori Vallow, Alex Cox, Melanie Gibb, and David Warwick, who were friends of his, right?
Well, I think the relationship with Alex Cox and Lori Vallow was closer than what it was different than those other names that you mentioned and closer than friendship.
Right. But let's take, and we'll talk a little bit about the Alex Cox Lori Vallow relationship, but let's, as far as the other wars were concerned, all of the emails and text all of the text messages, that you talked about, they had a recurring theme. These people were friends, right?
Yes.
And these friends talked about religious beliefs, correct?
Yes.
And these religious beliefs may not be what everybody else believes in, but they seem to have a consistent theme, and they were all consistent in believing whatever Lori, Chad, David, and Melanie were talking about. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair.
Okay. So when you talk about a group, we're really talking about a group of friends who have some maybe not traditional beliefs, but have religious beliefs, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the text I put up there from Lori to Chad, and it's the one line 836. Oh, wait. Let me know when you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
You okay? You all set?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you take that as being would you take that as being in somewhat of a sarcastic tone?
No, I think Lori was was pushing Chad and was serious.
Okay. So you should give all of your love and your attention to your wife and family. That's what she's saying, right?
Yes.
I'm just a distraction. Go have fun with your family. There's nothing sarcastic about that?
Well, if you look at Chad Daybell's reaction, which is that is so crushing and I feel so destroyed inside, I don't think he took it as being sarcastic.
Okay. I really do want you to. I just can't be in the way anymore. If things change, then we can talk, but we have nothing until things change. So she's basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, unless something changes, we have nothing to do with each other. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay. So what she's doing is she's saying that unless something happens, either you divorce your wife or you kill your wife or your wife dies, you don't have me.
I agree.
Okay. And then Chad responds, I'm constantly begging for change below. You see that?
I do.
But I'm hindering your life and you deserve better. I love you so intensely. Okay. You see that?
I do.
The text following that, did any of them say, all right, I agree with you, Lori. Let's kill Tammy. You find any of those?
I found a number of texts talking about Tammy's death percentage in subsequent conversations.
Yeah. You're also aware that Chad Daybell, maybe you're not, but are you aware that since 2016, Chad Daybell had been talking to these public audiences about the fact that Tammy was going to have a very short life?
I was aware that he made those statements to particular individuals. I'm not aware that he spoke of that publicly, but yes, I know that he communicated that Tammy was going to die to a number of people.
Right. And these other individuals are friends and family of Chad Daybell, who are also friends and family of Tammy Daybell, correct?
That I don't know. I can tell you the ones that I do know that he spoke with.
Okay.
And I'm not aware that they knew Tammy.
Okay. Okay. So it wasn't necessarily a secret that Chad was keeping with anybody since 2016, that he felt he had a premonition or a belief that his wife was going to have a short life, right?
There were certain people he communicated that to, correct?
Right. And when I'm reading through the text messages, and you went through your presentation, am I wrong when I'm reading these messages to read into this that Chad was waiting for Tammy to pass away, and that was what the delay was, correct?
It could be that, or it could be waiting to take action.
Okay. So we don't know what it was, right?
From the investigation, I believe I know what it was.
Okay. Well, people differ in their opinions, right?
They do.
Yeah. And Judge, could we approach for just a minute?
Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there's a thumb drive with a file in it. It may be a thumb drive that's having a few issues because it wanted to pull files and then it didn't. So we'll see if it will.
And it's here. Judge, I got it.
Okay. All right.
Surprise. Magical words. You did it. And Judge, I'm going to try to publish off of Exhibit 7 an email from, I believe it was from the Lolly Time, previously admitted exhibit number 7.
All right. Once you have that pulled up on your screen, let us know. And then
Judge, I'm ready.
Okay. I'll instruct the clerk this time to allow that to be published then.
Okay. Now, you previously mentioned about Phoebe, was your recollection was that it was Melanie Gibb. Is that correct?
I testified that I wasn't 100% certain of that, but I don't dispute that that's
Okay. So at the top, this is a text message from Phoebe from the Lolly Time to Lori Vallow. Would you read the first line?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks. I love you so much. I'm going to teach right now, teaching about discerning and shutting off dark portals.
Okay, and then the one below that.
I could see the darkness so clearing last night when I was teaching last night. Their eyes were dark like marbles.
Okay, now the date of those messages was when?
July 25th of 2019.
Were you aware during your investigation where Melanie Gibb was teaching on that particular occasion?
No, I'm not.
Okay. You are aware that Melanie Gibb taught classes, variety of different things about vibrations and about light and dark, correct?
I wasn't aware that she taught classes. I know there was a podcast and group discussions and things like that.
Right. She would go to encampments or she would go to programs and be a speaker talking about a variety of religious topics, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so when Melanie Gibb talks about dark portals, is that something she's talking about that's consistent with the LDS faith to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. When she's talking about eyes being like dark marbles, is that also something that's consistent with being of the LDS faith?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Okay. And to avoid, and Judge, we can bring that down now. I'm done. But during your research, there were other individuals that talked about putting numeric numbers on people with dark and light, right?
There was one single instance in all of my review where Lori Vallow disputed a designation made by Chad Daybell. So that's the only other time I'm aware of anyone else putting those numbers on individuals.
Okay. And all I want to do is just have you confirm then for me. In the review of all of those 10,000 plus text messages, are you telling me that other than Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, they were the only ones who talked about dark and light and put a numeric number on someone?
I am testifying that the only times I saw those numbers being generated, with the exception of one occasion, were all by Chad Daybell.
Okay. Okay. And all of the people that were designated, well, so other than Chad Daybell, your testimony then is that nobody else put numeric numbers on people as it related to dark and light. Is that right?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Okay. You brought up a subject about the process of sealing. Remember that in the very beginning of your testimony?
It's part of the James and Elena story, correct?
Right. But you also explained that what sealing is in your definition, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I understood sealing to be part of a marriage process when two couples of the LDS faith go into a temple and they perform a private ceremony. Is that what you understand it to be as well?
Yes, when two people go to get married, correct.
Right. And that is a process in which, and I don't want to go into, we don't need to go into significant detail about this, but it's a religious symbolism to show that they have an intent of wanting to be together the rest of their life, right?
Correct.
And they're basically sealing themselves to each other in essence, right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Has nothing to do with with death or anything like that. It has everything to do with the celebration of the marriage ceremony, correct?
It's a marriage ordinance that's performed in LDS temples.
Okay, all right. Okay. And Judge, I'm going to stop there. That's all I have at this point, Judge. Thank you.
All right, that will conclude cross-examination of the witness. Redirect from the state.
Agent Hart, you were just asked about the ceiling reference in one of those messages. Do you recall testifying about that before?
I do.
And you were asked specifically about it dealing with the marriage ceremony by Mr. Pryor, correct?
Yes.
And previously, did you testify that there are also sealings done for people that have passed away?
That's correct.
And when you referenced the James and Elena story, was that your understanding of what was being referenced at that time?
Judge, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Was that your understanding of what was being referenced in the James and Elena story?
Yes, the sealings being referred to in the James and Elena story are what they call proxy, meaning that genealogical research is done and that a man and a woman go in and, based on historical records, if two people had been married, they then perform that marriage ceremony in their behalf. The two people performing the ceremony aren't getting married. They're a stand-in for people based on genealogical research who are being sealed.
And at the time that was done, that was in the November of 2018?
November 16th of 2018.
And at that time, was Charles Vallow still alive?
No, he was not. Or excuse me, yes, he was. I'm sorry, I was thinking of 2019.
2019. So in November of 2018, Charles Vallow was still alive.
He was.
And in November of 2018, was Tammy Daybell still alive?
She was.
And is part of the idea behind the sealing that you would be married for eternity?
Judge, leading question.
Sustain.
When we looked at those messages, if you recall, was the indication that Chad believed or was indicating he and Lori would be married eternally?
That's precisely what was stated in Chad's writing.
Through your investigation, were you able to determine where the teachings of light and dark originated as far as this particular group of individuals you were asked about?
They originated from Chad Daybell.
And you indicated Melanie Gibb was one of the individuals that would have received those teachings?
I believe so, yes.
You were asked some questions about levels and light and dark, and specifically in reference to Allie Bloomer. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Was Allie Bloomer a telestial relative of Chad or Lori?
Not to my knowledge.
And we talked a little bit about that telestial relative, the meaning of that, and Mr. Pryor put that slide back up. You'd referenced that it is the lowest kingdom. Would that also be, would telestial refer here on earth?
Yes.
So the reference was the telestial relatives were obstacles.
Correct.
Through your investigation, did you learn if Charles was ever deemed dark?
Charles Vallow,
Charles Vallow.
he was.
Did you ever learn whether Tylee Ryan was deemed dark?
She was.
Did you ever learn whether JJ Vallow was deemed dark?
He was deemed to have turned into a zombie, which
Judge, unresponsive.
Overruled.
is parallel to being dark, being inhibited by a dark entity.
And what about Tammy Daybell? Did you ever learn whether she was deemed dark?
Again, she was deemed to have been inhibited by a dark entity.
And based on your investigation and looking through these messages, who was the one that would determine if someone was light or dark?
Chad Daybell.
And of those 4 relatives that we talked about, are you aware of their current status?
All 4 are dead.
I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Blake. I don't think we got outside the scope of cross there or direct, so won't permit recross for this witness. That will conclude the testimony of Agent Hart. Is he going to be recalled potentially by either side?
He is going to be recalled by the state, Your Honor.
And he's going to be called by the defense as well, Judge.
All right, Agent Hart, going forward, then you're still under the court's exclusionary order, which disallows you from watching this trial or discussing your testimony or anybody else's testimony before you return to testify. I'll question you about that when you retake the stand in the future. So please abide by that exclusionary order. And with that, you may go ahead and step down, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Judge.